Most British people know very little about Tom Paine, and yet it's doubtful whether any single British writer has ever had such an enormous impact on the world. And one of his books, The Age of Reason, was condemned throughout the world for preaching atheism. How do you preach atheism? Do you wander around the streets on a Sunday morning knocking on the doors of religious people, and when they answer go, "Have you heard the bad news?" Paine also wrote the best-selling book ever in America up to that time, which inspired the War of Independence. He wrote The Rights of Man, which became the best-selling book ever in Britain up to that time, and almost inspired a revolution. And then he wrote The Age of Reason. Paine was a corset maker from the town of Thetford in East Anglia. So straight away that seems strange. Can you be a revolutionary from East Anglia? You can't imagine someone going, "Well, you've got to smash the state." I mean, if the people don't seize power, it's rumbled, doesn't it? In fact, it seems hard to imagine anybody English being passionate enough to be that stroppy. Other nationalities, yeah, like the Americans or the Spanish or the Italians, they'll get annoyed about anything. You could say, you should be able to use a knife and fork with spaghetti. Hey, a knife and fork and spaghetti. But an Englishman, you could go up and say, I would like to take away your wife in exchange for a mule. Well, you better go, dear, we don't want to make a fuss. Some people clearly do remember his impact. In 1964, the mayor of this town insisted that he would only agree to that statue being erected if it was inscribed with the words "convicted traitor." The mayor didn't get his way, but I don't know, maybe they came to some sort of a compromise. Paine was born in 1737 within sight of the local gallows, where there were regular hangings. Paine's father was a corset maker and, like many craftsmen with radical views, was also a Quaker. But at the age of 19, Tom ran away from home to be a pirate on a ship called the Terrible, captained by a sailor called Captain Death. No wonder he became a pirate. What else can you do once you're called Captain Death? Then Paine went to Sandwich in Kent to try starting up his own corset-making business. But this didn't work, and neither did his marriage. In 1774, at the age of 37, out of work and bankrupt, he decided to completely abandon the life he'd been leading and go in search of something entirely different. He met the writer Benjamin Franklin, who persuaded him to go to America. And this wasn't just a physical journey, but a political one. From now on, he was the enemy of royalists everywhere. Paine arrived in America at the beginning of the country's movement for independence from Britain. America at the time was made up of 13 separate British colonies. They weren't allowed to trade with each other or issue their own money. Then in 1765, the Stamp Act was passed, which allowed the British government to impose taxes on America. Taxes were introduced on church correspondence, liquor licences, court documents, on wills and on dice. In response to the new taxes, a crowd attacked the governor of Massachusetts' house with axes. A mass campaign broke out and the British repealed all the new duties except for one, on tea. Now, everything revolved around tea. Opponents of British rule in Boston resolved that no Americans should aid the sale of tea. Medical reports were produced proving that tea was poisonous. Public notices were posted by the Sons of Liberty warning local tea agents they would be considered as
wretches, unworthy to live and made the first victims of our resentment.
And this culminated in the dumping of tons of tea in Boston Harbour. After the tea dumping, known as the Boston Tea Party, most of the colonies made it an offence to drink tea. Did that mean there were old dears knocking on the doors of shady dealers at night to buy their stash of tea leaves and then going, well, it's like Elsie. She was smuggling some bags back from Morocco. Well, she swallowed them to get them through customs. One of them's burst in her stomach. Time she got home, she was really refreshed. This was the state of affairs when Paine arrived in Philadelphia in search of work. He approached a publisher with some manuscripts he'd written and was offered a job writing articles for the Pennsylvania Magazine. This was when it became clear that Paine bore huge resentment towards the injustices he'd seen and could articulate this with great effect. He wrote later,
"When the country in which I'd set foot began to stir, I knew now was the time to act."
One of his articles was aimed at Christians who defended slavery. Soon after he'd started his writing job, the Battle of Lexington took place when British troops fired on an American crowd assembled to protest against the new taxes and killed 8 of them. And that's when he wrote the pamphlet Common Sense. It put the case for independence from Britain. It was against monarchy and for a democratic republic with annual elections, and it was full of phrases like,
"Nature disapproves the hereditary right of kings. Otherwise she would not so frequently ridicule it by giving mankind an ass for a lion."
George III, he said, was only king by being a descendant of William the Conqueror, who was a
French bastard landing with an armed banditti and establishing himself King of England against the consent of the natives.
something for everyone there. Even a royalist cabbie would go.
Mind you, he's got a point about the frogs.
And he also wrote that the king was a
sottish, stupid, stubborn, worthless, brutish man who resembles a common murderer, a highwayman or a housebreaker.
Clearly, he wasn't attacking the British, he was attacking the system of Britain. Whereas up until then, the demand of the colonies was mostly for a higher status within the empire. It's as if the attitude to George III was, well, maybe if I do everything George tells me, eventually he might let me have a little tiny bit of influence. The effect of Payne's book even reached George Washington, who didn't support independence until persuaded to by Paine. And coupled with this, do you know he had wooden teeth? But it wasn't just the pamphlet's radicalism that astonished people, it was the style. No one had written about politics for common people before. Political writing had always come in huge, expensive volumes, full of Latin and Greek. To most people, politics was meant to be unintelligible. It was like the shipping forecast. So Payne's pamphlet was like hearing...
And here is the shipping forecast at 16:04 GMT.
Blimey, there's a storm brewing up over Finisterre. I'd keep well away from there if I was you.
Within 6 months, 150,440 copies of Common Sense had been sold, and the total population was only 3 million, which at the time made it the biggest-selling book in America ever. Publishers printed thousands of bootleg copies, knowing they were guaranteed to sell them.
Come on, £5.
Paine was so concerned at getting out as many copies as possible, he didn't bother with copyright and didn't make any money from the book, not even enough to pay the printers. A few months later, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, inspired by the corset maker from Thetford. After the Declaration, the British Army attacked and captured the garrison at Fort Washington, and Paine joined the retreating American forces, but one soldier said he was...
a good philosopher, but not a soldier. He always kept well out of danger.
But Paine continued to write inspiring articles in a journal called The American Crisis. His first, written in December 1776, just as the Americans appeared to be defeated, was the one that began...
These are the times that try men's souls. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Read that back to me, will you, Joan?
These are the times
which was read to troops as they went into battle. Paine was rewarded by being made Secretary for Foreign Affairs. He was enormously flattered, as you would be. For a while, he went to live at Washington's country residence, and then Washington accepted Paine's invitation to...
spend a part of an evening at my apartment and eat a crust of bread and cheese.
That's cool, isn't it? Imagine the panic most people would be in if George Washington was coming round to dinner. Oh, my God, do you think he likes fish? What are we going to do for pudding? He's bound to tell us if he doesn't like the starter, as he cannot tell a lie. But Paine's just gone, there you are, crust of bread and cheese. I've got the King of France coming round tomorrow, he's getting a bowl of sugar puffs. But there was a tension between Paine and the other leaders. In 1780, Paine drafted a plan to tax the wealthy to help fund the army, which unsurprisingly the wealthy weren't too keen on. But there was something else. For Paine, the War of Independence was a battle for the high ideals of democracy, whereas for many of the American leaders, once they got Britain off their backs, they were more interested in just retaining their own position and protecting the status quo. Paine's radicalism had been useful to them for inspiring the troops, but once Britain had surrendered, it was just a nuisance. Paine had other disagreements with his colleagues. He supported the abolition of slavery, whereas Washington owned slaves. And Paine became friendly with the leader of the Iroquois Indians, called Chief Last Night. Whereas Washington described Native Americans as beasts of prey. And Paine fell out with a member of the government called Silas Deane, who Paine said had been illegally selling weapons. So Deane's supporters got Paine sacked as Foreign Secretary, which left him broke. Paine ended up applying to the government that he'd been a part of for a loan. As he was waiting for the loan to come through, he was thrown into debtor's prison. So by the time he was released, he decided that the most useful thing he could do would be to return to England. However, once he was back, he became obsessed with building a bridge. Throughout his life, he was fascinated by science, and at one point he tried to invent a smokeless candle. But now he was determined to become the man who would invent the iron bridge. An entrepreneur gave him some development money, but he didn't give him enough to build the bridge over anything, so Payne had to build his bridge on this bit of land here in a field in West London.
This is phase one, as you can
He
see.
hired carpenters to build a floor across it so it could be walked across, and then charged the public for going over it. And astonishingly, people used to do this, though it must have occurred to them that as the bridge was in a field, if they wanted to get to the other side of the field, they did have the option of walking across the field. Payne's fascination with bridges was part of his yearning for reason. Those who were opposed to democracy said that God had just made it that way, the way a parent might answer a child's questions with, "Because I said so." Whereas in physics, reason is dominance. You have to explain why things do what they do. There's no good screaming at a magnet, "What have I told you about attracting iron filings?" And a bridge is almost a symbol of reason, a triumph of rationality. For Paine, his bridge must have seemed not only a paragon of reason, but also an example of how reason can be artistic and beautiful. Or then again, maybe he just fancied building a bridge. While Paine had been constructing his bridge, the French Revolution had begun. And a member of Parliament for Bristol, Edmund Burke, had written a book called Reflections on the Revolution in France. Burke condemned the revolution and its democratic aims with phrases like,
The Chancellor of France said that all occupations were honourable. The occupation of a hairdresser cannot be a matter of honour to any person. If they are permitted to rule, you are at war with nature.
The crowds in Paris Burke referred to as the swinish multitude. But at the time, Paine was living round here in Islington, and he was so obsessed with building his bridge that he wasn't even aware of Burke's book. Until one day when he went up there for a stroll, saw the book, so bought a copy and read it. And he was so enraged that he retired to the Angel Inn where he was staying and didn't come out again until he'd written a reply that he called The Rights of Man, which was a defence of the French Revolution and a call for a similar change in this country. For example, the idea of hereditary rule, as he said, was
as absurd as a hereditary mathematician.
Well, I've got no idea, Richard, I'm afraid.
Paine was making the point that the most important argument against royalty is it's bloody mad. It's like when the Queen Mother died and up popped all these cockneys going, "Oh, I'll tell you what, I'll never forget it. 1942, blooming great doodle bugs come straight through the roof, knocked the whole street down. I'm buried up to me neck in rubble, me legs shorn clean off. I look over and there she was, the Queen Mother. Do you know, that was the happiest moment of my life." Stuff like this infuriated Paine as the very opposite of reason. For example, the royals have still today got a rule that the monarch is not allowed to marry a Catholic. What's that there for? Are they afraid if they relax that rule that the Queen would run off with Gerry Adams? Paine also condemned
Men in all countries who get their living by war and by keeping up the quarrels of nations.
The book was just over 100 pages and revealed the advantages of making Britain a democratic republic. Paine wrote,
Aristocracy has a tendency to degenerate the human species by intermarrying constantly with each other.
I bet that wound them up. It's true, though. That's how they get hundreds of thousands on countryside alliance marches. It's just a family outing. The book ended with Paine explaining why people like Burke hate the French Revolution.
That which is a blessing to nations is bitterness to them. They tremble at the approach of principles and dread the precedent that threatens their overthrow.
As soon as Paine could get out a cheap edition of The Rights of Man, tens of thousands of copies were sold. So he wrote a follow-up, The Rights of Man Part 2. And in the second part, he laid out in detail how Britain should redistribute its wealth.
The Duke of Richmond alone takes away as much for himself as would maintain 2,000 poor and aged persons.
He proposed that the money saved by the abolition of royalty could pay for the first ever welfare state. He advocated pensions for everyone aged 50 and over and the first national state education system. There would be an allowance to cover funeral expenses. Then you'd have had the Daily Mail going,
We uncover the cheats with nothing wrong with them, deliberately dying to get their free coffin.
He proposed building a hall to accommodate central London's homeless, whereas the only way the government had proposed that now would be if they could do it through sponsorship. The second part of The Rights of Man became the best-selling book of all time, literally a craze.
I mean, I remember at the time it was something of a sort of publishing phenomenon because the population was about 10 million, half of them couldn't read, but it still sold.
Get up, stand up for your right.
It was an enormous success because he caught what people sensed, that they were treated as dirt.
The main reason I remember it coming out, the actual day, was on a Monday, because the Arsenal had to play Blackburn. If we won that, we went through to the quarter-finals of the Cup. Sales of programmes dropped by nearly 25% because everyone just brought The Rights of Man. So you got half-time, you had, instead of your pint and your pie, you just sat there and read Chapter 4, The Rights of Man, and what we should all be doing.
Well, 100,000 copies means almost everybody, and people would gather to read it. I think it's said that in every cottage there was a copy and people would go and discuss it.
Every cutler in Sheffield had a copy of The Rights of Man, which, of course, led to the Great Teaspoon shortage of 1792.
The most important thing was the price. It was so cheap.
Everybody had a copy. People who couldn't read it had a copy. It's just, you just had to have it. It was just one of those things. It's like an iPod.
Well, I'll be honest with you, my mate Tommy Mercado had a load of them in it, a big old bag out the back, and used to sell them at knock-off price even again.
Payne's style was again described as vulgar. The gentleman author Isaac Hunt described it as
coarse and rustic, seducing his illiterate and unskilled readers.
Which is uncannily similar to now, when loads of newspapers and political magazines seem to think that anything vaguely readable is somehow vulgar. So they're full of articles by people like Janet Daly and Simon Jenkins that are actually impossible to read. Which is quite an achievement when you think about it. I mean, even the dictionary is readable. You can go aardvark, aardwolf, abacus. But trying to read these people is like trying to do that trick where someone bets you can't eat 3 dry cream crackers in a row. And you think, oh no, I will get to the end, it can't be that hard. And halfway through you find yourself going, Liberal Democrat confirmed for public for Walker. And it was Payne's accessible style that terrified the government. The writer William Godwin had written a book putting the case against royalty, but it was inaccessible and expensive, and so it was never banned. Following the publication of The Rights of Man, a huge movement for reform erupted. Prime Minister Pitt issued a proclamation against seditious and wicked writings, to which the MPs cried, "Damn Paine!" He was charged with seditious libel, and fearing he was about to be executed, Paine fled to France. On his arrival in France, he was instantly invited to join the National Assembly, the parliament that was set up after the overthrow of King Louis XVI. Soon after Paine arrived, the National Assembly began to debate whether or not to execute the king. Now, Paine had always insisted that it wasn't individual royals that were the problem, it was the whole system of royalty that troubled him. He'd always imagined that once a monarch had been deposed, that they would be deported, so he voted against the execution. But his first problem in taking part in this debate must have been that, despite being a member of their parliament, he'd never learnt a word of French. So his contribution must have sounded like any British person talking to a bunch of foreigners. What we need to do with the king... Oh, they don't understand me. What we need to do with the king with the crown. Oh, God, they don't even know what a king is. The crown! Off the stamps, the one off the money. Oh, how thick can you get? The one off the coins, the king! Payne's other difficulty was that with European armies advancing on Paris and the king backing their invasion, the majority in the Assembly argued that the king had to be guillotined. They won the vote and the king was executed. But then the leaders of the Assembly jailed the most prominent opponents of the execution, including Paine. He was sent to this building, which had been a palace, but during the revolution was turned into a jail. And then he had another dreadful piece of luck. While he was here, the Great Terror was introduced, in which hundreds of people were guillotined. And so Tom Paine, who'd arrived in Paris as one of the most prominent supporters of the revolution, was told that the revolution had sentenced him to death.
Prochain, la guillotine. Bien, par rapport à l'inférieur gauche, un guillotine pour chacun.
Each morning at 6 o'clock, a turnkey would walk round the prison with a list of the prisoners due to be executed later that day. When he came to the cell of a condemned prisoner, he'd chalk a cross on the outside of the door, and later that day, porters would arrive. They'd go into the cells marked with a cross and take the condemned prisoners to the guillotine. During his stay in prison, Paine got a fever, so the prison governor allowed him to have his cell door open for fresh air. That day, the turnkey arrived at Paine's cell. He stopped and marked a cross on the door. But because the door was open, he'd chalked the inside. After he went, Paine shut the door, and that night the porters arrived to take away that day's victims. But as they got to Paine's door, they couldn't see the cross, so they went away. The jailer walked off and Paine stayed alive. And even luckier for Paine, a few days later the Jacobins were overthrown and the new regime took him off the condemned list before anybody had noticed the mistake. While he was in jail, he started work on his next book, The Age of Reason. And one of the extraordinary things about this is that not only did he detail the ways in which the Bible contradicts itself, but he started it in his cell from memory. For Paine, the main enemy of reason was organised religion. He started the book by saying that all major religions are based on a miracle. But, he said, whenever these miracles happen, they were only ever witnessed by one or two people. It's like that recent story of a man in Lancashire who bought an aubergine at a market stall, and when he got it home, he cut it open and found that the pattern inside said God. So people came from miles around to worship the holy aubergine. As if God's going to say, some people still don't believe in me, eh? I know what'll prove it once and for all. I shall spell my name with the juicy bits of a single purple vegetable somewhere in Bolton. Christians, said Paine, tell us to worship a God who sent out his only son to die. What sort of an example is that? And about the Bible, he said,
whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and tortuous executions, it would be more consistent that we called it the word of a demon than the word of God.
I'll be there in 10.
But the major part of the book was his detective-like analysis of where the Bible doesn't add up. He questioned why, if Jesus was to make everything known to all nations, he could only speak one language. And the first 5 books of the Old Testament are by Moses, so why do 3 of these books always refer to Moses in the third person? And Numbers chapter 12 verse 3 says,
the man Moses was very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth.
Paine said that if Moses really wrote this, that must make him the most arrogant man on earth.
Call it a hunch, but I've got a feeling that this entire book is a pack of lies.
The Age of Reason had the impact of Lady Chatterley's Lover, Satanic Verses and Fahrenheit 9/11 rolled into one. And even more astonishing, when he wrote this, he was almost 60. The Age of Reason became another bestseller in Britain and in Germany and Hungary and sold tens of thousands of copies in one day in Philadelphia. By now, Paine seemed to revel in causing uproar. He became one of these people who could cause an argument with anyone and wasn't happy unless he was having a row. He wrote a letter to George Washington condemning his running of America and was especially angry that Washington had done nothing to get him released from prison. And the letter ended,
as to you, sir, the world will be puzzled as to whether you have abandoned your principles or whether you had any.
I'm surprised he didn't put, and P.S. you still owe me $1 for that cheese. Even then, he wasn't idle, and he helped Napoleon with a plan to invade England to inspire a revolution. Paine wrote a pamphlet outlining his plans, but it's possible he was losing his common touch a bit by this point because the title was
Observations on the Construction and Operation of Navies with a Plan for Invasion of England and the Final Overthrow of the English Government.
Napoleon asked Paine to work for him full-time, but Paine felt that Napoleon was taking France towards dictatorship, so he refused. Napoleon was deeply insulted by this, and Paine described Napoleon as
the completest charlatan that ever lived.
Paine still couldn't go back to England, so he decided to return to America. And Thomas Jefferson, the new president of America, agreed to send a ship to collect Paine from France. But the Age of Reason and Paine's letter to Washington had turned a huge chunk of American society against him by now. Back in Philadelphia, Paine was attacked by mobs throwing stones. He offered to work for the government, but eventually they stopped even replying to his letters. And then, during an election, as Paine was handing in his ballot paper, he was told he wasn't even allowed to vote, as he wasn't an American. Paine was almost penniless and was taken in by a friend, William Carver. But even Mrs. Carver couldn't stand him and called him
a stinking atheist old troublemaker.
William Carver described Paine's condition.
His shirt was in tatters, and he gave off the most disagreeable smell possible, like that of our poor beggars in England. I got a tub of warm water and soap and washed him from head to foot, taking 3 times before I could get him clean. His toenails were like bird claws.
If anyone from social services had come round, they'd have gone, "Yes, Pop, of course you used to write books." I think he's getting worse this morning. He told us he once built a bridge across a field.
Yes, look at that. We like drawing, don't we?
Even the Quakers told him they decided not to allow him to be buried in their ground. One of the last conversations he had was with a doctor who tried to get him to accept that Jesus was the Son of God. They all failed, and on June the 8th, 1809, Paine died, unrepentant. Even then, the English reformer William Cobbett tried to get Paine's bones brought back from America so that he could be buried in England, but the bones were lost and have never been found. Ever since then, Paine's legacy has burst out in dozens of different ways. In the town of Lewes, they named a beer after him. Throughout the 19th century, Luddites, Chartists and trade unionists referred to the works of Paine for inspiration. And in the 1840s in Manchester, there were reports of meetings at which 3,000 factory workers would turn up to hear lectures about him. A book about the history of Merthyr Tydfil, written in the 1860s, says,
"A few who thought highly of the rights of man and the age of reason assembled in secret places on the mountains and, taking the works from under a concealed boulder, read them with great unction."
Has anyone ever read anything by a new Labour politician with any unction, let alone great unction? Could you imagine anybody sneaking up a mountain and going... Modern politicians often like to say that their heroes are people like Paine or Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King, because deep down they know that no one will ever say, you know, the man who really inspires me is Jack Straw. We can't all be Tom Paine, but we can all be little Tom Paines, changing a bit of history by being the first in the room to say, that's not right, we're not standing for that, so that everyone else, what I was thinking. If Tom Paine has one thing to say to us, it's... make a fuss.
And it said, this is the age of reason. These are the rights of man. Kick off religion and monarchy. It was written in Tom Paine's plan. Then I will dance to Tom Paine's bones. We'll dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own. To the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones.
Start a revolution in your head by going to the Mark Steele Lectures website. Find it at open2.net.
Tom Paine's bones.